Chicago. Shamelessly ambitious. Totally uncompromising. A giant machine for satisfying appetites and making money.
Growth is God in Chicago. This thing ain't ever gonna stop.
Exploding out of nowhere in the mid-19th century, Chicago owes its success to its location, right on the shore of Lake Michigan, America's original superhighway.
No one thinks of Chicago as a maritime city, but if you don't have the lake, you don't have Chicago.
Hidden in this vast body of water, the secret history of a remarkable city. Tragic wrecks.
This is in beautiful condition, absolutely gorgeous.
And mysterious structures. What can draining Lake Michigan tell us about the extraordinary risks, engineering marvels, and superhuman endeavor that create an American icon? (1860), and Chicago is booming. It's all thanks to its location at America's sweet spot, where the Great Lakes meet the waterways that stretch across the country and down to the Gulf of Mexico. Lake Michigan is teeming with ships, packed with goods and people, including ever-expanding numbers of commercial travelers who rely upon transport across the lake. What can some tangled wreckage on the lakebed reveal about boom-time Chicago, where success comes with a side order of risk? A survey team, led by maritime archaeologist Mallory Haas, is heading out onto the lake to take a look. They're aiming for an area 16 miles north of the city, the last known location of a luxury paddle steamer, the Lady Elgin. Known as Queen of the Lakes, she's popular with Chicago's business travelers, thanks to her reputation as one of the fastest ships on the lake. She sails from Chicago on the evening of September 7th, 1860, heading back to Milwaukee.
So many of the excursionists had had a long day. They looked forward to returning home to Milwaukee, to business. This was supposed to be just an overnight trip.
But less than halfway into her journey, she sinks, with 400 passengers on board. It's one of the worst maritime disasters in American history. So what happens? Mallory and her team are looking for clues.
I'm hoping we'll be able to find some material that's like easily identifiable. Parts of the ship, structure maybe, and even some personal items.
Fragments of the Lady Elgin were first discovered by diver Harry Zeich in 1989. Today, the expedition is using sonar to scan the entire site.
Oh. Can we have a closer look at this? That, to me, looks like an anchor.
Right now, it's just an anomaly. Matches the parameters of our targets.
This is really exciting.
This should be the wreck. But to make certain, they need to dive. The waters of Lake Michigan are notoriously cold, ideal for the preservation of shipwrecks. But Mallory must wear a dry suit to cope with the freezing conditions. As she descends, she spots a snake-like trail of what looks like a rope or chain.
This is so very cool.
It leads her to a dramatic sight. The remnants of the Lady Elgin.
It's beautiful and very eerie all at the same time.
Just a few feet away, the Lady Elgin's anchor, upright on the lake bed. And now, by draining away the waters of Lake Michigan, we can see it in perfect detail. $1.3 quadrillion gallons of lake water. Icy cold and crystal clear, drains away. For the first time in 160 years, the Queen of the Lakes emerges into the daylight. Her anchor chain is firmly snagged around a boulder. Lying on the sand is a remarkably well-preserved wooden structure. But careful examination reveals that this is the bow section only. So, where is the rest of the ship? The team sets out to find more.
This is an ongoing search. I would love to know where all of the material from this shipwreck is.
Scanning expert Reagan Lipinski widens the search, exploring ever further from the main wreck site. Nearly a mile away, he detects something new.
I can see a lot of debris that appears to be man-made. We're seeing kind of a jigsaw puzzle of pieces.
The drained lake bed is strewn with numerous wooden and metal fragments from all parts of the ship. And poignant glimpses into daily life on board. A hand truck used to load cargo, a wash basin, and one of the distinctive chandeliers from the Lady Elgin saloon.
When I see these different pieces, it looks like the ship was falling apart as it was moving through the water.
Analysis of the wreck reveals that the Lady Elgin suffers massive damage, but her bow section sits nearly a mile away, having come to a stop when the anchor chain became snagged. What's still missing is any clue to what causes her to go down. Then, as they follow the debris trail, a new and unexpected discovery.
All right, so we have something here.
Okay.
Now, we definitely have a man-made structure here.
Yeah.
If we zoom in on them, we can see it looks like it's cylindrical.
Yes, it does.
What they find stands out clearly on the drained lake bed. The Lady Elgin's distinctive 25-foot boilers. Importantly, they're intact, with only minor damage. So, although many steamships of this era are destroyed by boiler explosions, Lady Elgin clearly wasn't one of them. Still hunting for an answer, the team turns to the historical archives. Historian Valerie Van Heest studies newspapers from September 1860 and discovers some important information.
We know from survivor counts that the seas were building all through that journey. The weather here in the Great Lakes can change on a dime. This is a dangerous body of water.
And eyewitness statements reveal that bad weather's not the only problem. At 2:20 in the morning, the captain of the Lady Elgin spies the light of another vessel heading straight towards them.
Both ships were on a collision course for each other.
Combining data from scanning Lake Michigan with historical research, the archaeological team can now piece together the final journey of the Lady Elgin. It's 11 p.m. on the 7th of September, 1860. And the notoriously unpredictable Lake Michigan weather is going from bad to worse. The Lady Elgin's experienced captain, Jack Wilson, considers delaying his departure. But according to newspaper reports, he's under pressure from his passengers. They have business to attend to and meetings the next day.
They encouraged Captain Wilson to speed on ahead. And against his better judgment, he headed out into the open waters of the lake and into a wild storm of unbelievable proportions.
16 miles out on the lake, with visibility getting worse by the minute. The crew suddenly spies another ship sailing towards them. A lumber-carrying schooner called the Augusta. Eyewitness reports show that the two captains try to take evasive action. But it's too late. Augusta's jib boom punctures the Lady Elgin's hull like a bayonet.
There were screams as people realized that the Lady Elgin would go down. And back then, people didn't know how to swim. Drowning was an imminent peril for so many of these people.
The two ships are tossed apart, but the Lady Elgin has been ripped open. People and their belongings spill into the lake as she fills with water. Then, the ship's boilers crash through the bottom of the hull. She's fatally wounded, breaking apart. But the bow section remains afloat, blowing south for a quarter of a mile before her trailing anchor chain catches on a boulder. It's here that the Queen of the Lakes finally sinks to the bottom.
The real tragedy here is so many people survived the night. They reached near shore only to encounter the pounding surf where they lost their lives.
300 lives are lost. It's one of the worst ever tragedies on the Great Lakes. In the aftermath, fingers are pointed at the captains of both ships. But blame is shared with the businessmen and women who urged the captain to sail into the building storm.
Time was money, and they took risks that they shouldn't have taken.
In Chicago, nothing is allowed to get in the way of progress and making money. What can a strange underwater structure in the lake tell us about an ingenious plan to overcome a deadly threat to the city's success? Author Ben Sells is investigating an unusual building. 3.5 miles out from the Chicago shoreline.
I mean, you look at it, it's hard to know what it is. It almost looks like somebody could live in it, but you never see anybody there. There's a lighthouse, there's a horn, and now all that's there are the birds. And it's just this mysterious enigma, all alone out here in the lake, and yet so beautiful. It makes you wonder what it could possibly be.
It's clearly much more than a lighthouse. And it doesn't have the battlements associated with a military fort. What is this strange cathedral-like structure? And can peeling back the waters of Lake Michigan reveal the true role of this mysterious building? As the lake water spirals away, it exposes a massive column reaching 38 feet below the waterline. A steel frame filled with 24,000 tons of concrete, weighing it securely to the bottom of the lake. Inside, a large pipe that disappears underground. The construction techniques clearly date the building to the 19th century. This is a boom time for Chicago, but a dangerous one too. In the 1850s, thousands of immigrants arrive in the city every month. By 1860, there are more than 100,000 people living here.
They had more Germans in Chicago than they had in Hamburg. There's more Jews than in Jerusalem, more Irish than are in Dublin.
And they use the lake on their doorstep with little thought for the consequences.
Chicago stunk to high hell. It really did. There was no control over the pollution from the factories, although the biggest pollution was the water pollution.
Chicago dumps all its sewage and industrial waste straight into its river, from where it flows directly into Lake Michigan, the city's only supply of drinking water. It's a recipe for disaster. A single cholera outbreak in 1854 kills more than 1 in 50 of the city's population.
You're healthy at breakfast and you're dead by dinner. It's like somebody hitting you in the back with an axe. Chicago became, by the 1850s, almost uninhabitable.
To learn more about how the early city fathers solved this problem, Ben Sells turns to historic maps of the lakeshore from the city archive.
What you can see is tunnel after tunnel, almost like arteries coming from the lake to shore. And the question is, what were they feeding? What were they for?
Removing the earth from the drained lakebed uncovers this series of tunnels. And exploration of the oldest of these structures exposes a brick-lined shaft almost tall enough to walk through. It runs all the way back to the shore, and it doesn't stop there. The tunnel continues straight on into the heart of the city, finally emerging on downtown Chicago's main artery, Michigan Avenue, from where it runs directly to this grand stone building. So, what is it for? Author Ben Sells is investigating an extraordinary tunnel under Lake Michigan. And city records reveal that it's designed by one of Chicago's forgotten heroes, engineering genius Ellis Chesbrough. The blueprints of Chesbrough's system make its purpose crystal clear, pumping clean water into the city. Several engineering wonders are interconnected in Chesbrough's ingenious system. The ornate downtown building is a massive pumping station, sucking water in through the 2-mile-long tunnel. And the circular fort out on the lake turns out to be a crib, a giant reinforced structure, housing and protecting a huge intake pipe. Chesbrough's plan is to bring in fresh, clean water from the middle of the lake, far away from Chicago's lakeshore pollution. Nothing like this has ever been built before in America. When completed, this awe-inspiring structure has a capacity to pump 10 million gallons of fresh water a day into the city.
Without Ellis Chesbrough's vision, without his courage, it's hard to imagine that we would have seen the growth and that we would have the Chicago that we have today.
Chesbrough solves the city's clean water crisis, but that's only half of his achievement. Chicago is drowning in dirt and disease, and desperately needs a new sewer system. But there's a problem. The city is only 2 feet above water level. There's not a steep enough gradient to drain the waste away. Chesbrough's radical solution is to create the gradient by building the sewers above ground. Then, to make it work, Chesbrough comes up with a mind-blowing plan to raise an entire city, every street and every building.
I'm talking about fire hydrants, street lights, hotels, houses, the works. They would dig under these hotels and they put these platforms underneath it, and you get these jacks, maybe 600 guys, and then each person would turn the screw a little like this, eek, it's up 1/8 of it, eek, 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 till it's 12 feet high.
A massive section of city block, measuring 320 feet long and weighing 35,000 tons, is raised in one go. It takes 600 men and 6,000 jack screws to get the job done. Raising the city out of the mud, installing a modern sewer system, and providing clean water turned Chicago into a modern metropolis and a wonder of the age. By the dawn of the 20th century, it's become the 5th largest city in the world, home to 2 million people. But in a city growing so fast, not everyone can keep up. What does this wreck of an aging sailboat reveal about the struggle to keep pace with change in the early 20th century? Maritime archaeologist Tamara Thompson is setting out to investigate the wreck of the Rouse Simmons. She's a schooner that spends 44 years transporting grain and timber up and down the lake. But in November 1912, she goes down, along with her entire crew. The wreck location is already known to local divers, so Tamara and her team head straight there. Diving to a depth of 170 feet, they come face to face with an awe-inspiring sight.
When I drop down on it, it's beautiful. It's absolutely intact, so it looks almost like something Walt Disney would put there in a shipwreck film.
Invasive species of mussels coat the ship's timbers. Billions of these filter-feeding creatures are responsible for the extraordinary clarity of the lake water, even at these great depths. But by covering every available surface of the wreck, the mussels also mask many of the ship's details. Using the latest sonar analysis, it's now possible to drain the lake, clear away the mussel shells, and reveal the secrets of the Rouse Simmons. As the waters recede, the ship's hull emerges, almost completely intact. But strewn along the base of the ship is something odd. Hundreds and hundreds of sticks. Close analysis shows them to be the remnants of small fir trees. The nature of the remains discovered on the ship, combined with the significance of the late November date, can mean only one thing. The Rouse Simmons must be carrying Christmas trees. Researching in the archives, Tamara makes a discovery. Every November, when similar ships are safely moored up for the winter, the Rouse Simmons is still on the lake. Her captain, Herman Schooneman, makes his last journey of the year, bringing fir trees from the far north of Lake Michigan down to the city, just in time for Christmas.
The Rouse Simmons would come in, sometimes caked in ice, literally like a floating iceberg. But at the top of her top mast would be tied a Christmas tree. And that was a signal to people in the city that she'd be open for business and the holidays could begin.
Schooneman even earns himself the nickname Captain Santa, thanks to his generosity in giving free trees to poor families. But in November 1912, all is not well. As Tamara digs further into the records, she unearths a very significant document.
One of the important discoveries that we found was the bankruptcy proceedings of Herman Schunemann. So it was very important for him in 1912 to be profitable.
Could this explain the fate of the Rouse Simmons? Evidence from the drained wreck of the Rouse Simmons reveals that many of her deck planks are dislodged or missing. The ship's remaining deck beams have V-shaped channels grouted across their length. It's a vital clue. Studying images from the dive, Tamara realizes that the strange grooves must be salt channels. A 19th century technique intended to protect the ship's timbers.
So by laying these salt channels down, they thought that this would preserve the wood and extend the longevity of the ship. But in fact, what it did was break down the iron fasteners that they were using to attach the decking.
Over time, the salt completely corrodes the metal fasteners, allowing deck planks to work loose. Which could be why many of them are missing from the ship, and may well have been lost before she set sail on her final voyage. The nearly bankrupt Captain Schunemann appears to be cutting corners on maintenance. But while the missing planks would certainly weaken the ship, are they enough on their own to cause her to sink? Exploring the foredeck area, the team makes another discovery. A coil of heavy anchor chain lying at the front of the boat. And underneath the ship's bow, a large impact mark in the sand. It's critical evidence. This vessel hits the lake bed nose first. Now, by combining all of this detail, Tamara can piece together what happens on the Rouse Simmons' final ill-fated voyage. She sets sail from Thompson, Michigan. Her hold and deck crammed with 10,000 trees, more than she's ever carried before. Eyewitnesses comment on the excessive load, saying she looks like a floating forest. The following afternoon, 120 miles further to the south, the weather takes a turn for the worse, and the overladen ship gets into distress. As the storm grows in strength, a huge wave smashes down on her foredeck. The missing deck planks mean she's soon swamped, and the heavy anchor and chain only make things worse. Their weight forces her prow underwater, and the rest of the ship follows. It's the likeliest explanation for the ship's tragic descent to the bottom of the lake.
We know from the reports of the life-saving station that they saw the vessel coming south on the lake just before 3 o'clock, and she had been flying an American flag upside down from her mainmast, which was a sign of distress.
A lifeboat races to help, but too late.
They saw no sign of the Rouse Simmons, and they saw no sign of wreckage on the surface.
It's only when Christmas trees start washing ashore along the lake that the crew's families begin to fear the worst. Captain Schunemann's debt-driven gamble sailing dangerously late in the season in his overloaded and badly maintained ship, ends in tragedy. There are no survivors. And this is no isolated incident. The storms that blow up out of nowhere on the Great Lakes take over 200 ships and over 1,300 lives in the decade following the Christmas tree disaster. Schooneman is clearly not the only Chicagoan running risks to turn a profit.
Chicago is all about risk. Failure doesn't bother people, it seems, in this town. They risk things, they fail, they come back, smack at it again.
Never is this combination of enterprise and risk-taking more evident than in time of war. December 1941, and the USA is dramatically drawn into World War II. For Chicago, America's industrial powerhouse, this presents a huge opportunity.
Wars have always been good for Chicago. Chicago made everything, from toothbrushes to harvesters, and almost everything that was needed by the Army is made in Chicago.
But this is not the city's only wartime contribution. What can draining a mysterious wreck in the lake reveal about how Chicago helps America prepare for a totally new kind of warfare? Maritime archaeologists from the U.S. Navy, working alongside the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, are surveying an area of Lake Michigan. They're in search of Chicago's wartime secrets. The team uses the latest scanning technology to scour the lake bed. After several days of painstaking work, they pinpoint an object of interest and send a dive team down for a closer look.
Well, we've got 2 divers down looking at a possible wreck. We don't know for sure what it is, but it's definitely man-made. It's really exciting.
Around 100 feet down, the divers discovered not a boat, but an aircraft. The plane has at least 2 seats. The fuselage has completely disappeared, but the wings are still perfectly intact. It's an intriguing discovery, but it's far from clear what type of plane this is, or what it's doing here. Peeling back the waters and draining Lake Michigan offer a better view. The full outline of a square-winged aircraft becomes visible on the lake bed. Using CGI to remove silt below the wings uncovers a surprise. The undercarriage has been engaged. This plane appears to be trying to land in the middle of the lake. Why would it do this? Divers have discovered the wreck of an aircraft which appears to have been trying to land in the middle of Lake Michigan. Extraordinary U.S. Navy footage from World War II may shed light on this mystery. It shows military aircraft training to land on aircraft carriers on the waters of Lake Michigan. But why train here, so far from the ocean? In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. realizes that war in the Pacific can only be won from the air. Aircraft carriers will be the decisive weapon. There's an urgent need for specially trained pilots.
Now, you can train men in airfields around the country, but what you're not able to train them in is something essential, particularly for the Pacific War, and that's flying off of and landing on an aircraft carrier.
Safe from enemy attack, and with its massive lake, Chicago is the perfect place to practice carrier landings. But in 1942, America has only 7 carriers in commission, and all are needed in combat. So, what's the answer? Historical research into the U.S. Navy archives reveals an ingenious solution devised by Chicago engineers.
So what is decided is to take 2 steamers in the Great Lakes, cut them down, put flight decks on them, and turn them into aircraft carriers far away from the theater of war.
The Navy gives the shipyards 120 days to deliver. And in true Chicago spirit, the first ship is ready in just 59. These steamer carriers relaunch as the USS Wolverine and the USS Sable. So what are the aircraft that train on these carriers? And why has this one crashed into the lake? Careful analysis of the design details of the wreck enables the team to close in on an identification. The plane's cockpit is positioned distinctively close to the front of the aircraft. The final clue is the telltale aerodynamic design of the turret. There's no doubt, this is a Grumman Avenger.
This big aircraft is a U.S. Navy TBM Avenger of World War II. These carrier-based aircraft were used in large numbers in the Pacific War. These craft in particular were designed to drop out of the sky, launch a torpedo, and send it into the side of an enemy ship.
With its long range and large bomb payload, the Avenger plays a vital role in the destruction of the Japanese Navy. But landing an Avenger is no mean feat. Pilots say it's like flying a truck.
Not every pilot can take off and land on a tiny little piece of a ship out in the middle of the ocean.
So it's a lot of coordination and a lot of calculation in your head to make that landing on a postage stamp. In a typical day, you would maybe have 100 pilots training. It was constant. As soon as that sun came out, pilots were landing and taking off.
For the rookie pilot, there are many challenges, judging the strength of a headwind and the speed of the carrier. Vital for a successful landing is the pilot's ability to deploy the tailhook, catching the cable on the carrier deck to bring the plane to a halt.
Catching that wire is critical, because if you missed a wire, your aircraft was not going to stop. And that's like going from 80 miles an hour to a complete stop.
Not every attempt at landing is successful. The wartime evidence and data from the drained wreck proves this must be one of the casualties of the World War II training program. Further scanning of the lake by the Naval Search Team reveals that the drained Avenger is not alone.
As you can see here, pretty well preserved.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, very much intact.
Second World War records show that between 1942 and 1945, 8 trainee pilots are lost on Lake Michigan. And more than 120 aircraft disappear beneath the water. Fighter planes, dive bombers, and 36 Avengers. The identity and fate of the wrecked aircraft are now clear. But the identity of the pilot who crashed into the lake remains unknown. It's a powerful reminder of a vital episode in the story of America's war in the Pacific, and testimony to the courage and innovation of the men who served and trained on Chicago's lake. Today, Lake Michigan is busier than ever. Now, it's mostly pleasure boats, bought with the riches that Chicago has created. Rail, road, and air transport have largely replaced the waterborne freight of the city's golden age. But the story of that great era still lies safely preserved in the ice-cold waters of the lake. Dynamic. In your face. And always moving forward.
No city looks more to the future than New York City.
The Big Apple grew out of water. The secret story of its success lies hidden under its 2 rivers and its mighty harbor.
This is one of the most notorious stretches of water on the New York waterfront.
Imagine if we could empty the oceans, letting the water drain away to reveal the secrets of the seafloor. Now, we can. Using accurate data and astonishing technology to bring light once again to a lost world. How does the horror of 9/11 lead to an extraordinary discovery from the birth of America?
The most grisly and bloodiest event of the entire Revolutionary War.
What does this offshore wreck reveal about the city's explosive growth?
People talked about the forest of masts.
And what sank this huge U.S. warship just miles from New York? The largest city in America. 300 square miles. 8.5 million people. Tenacious, powerful, confident. All of it built from scratch in just 400 years. And the secret to its success, its rivers and harbor. In the waters around New York, archaeologists have located thousands of wrecks. Time capsules that can reveal this city's incredible story in a new light. One in particular. What is this strange wreck? And why is it here? as New Yorkers recover from the shock of 9/11. The ruins of the Twin Towers reveal a secret from the very start of their city's story.
Little did we know that from this terrible tragedy, there would be a major discovery, a secret from the past.
By 2010, 1.8 million tons of debris have been removed. The construction of a high-security parking garage is underway.
They decided to make that entrance underground, so they dug down deeper than they had before.
22 feet beneath the tarmac. In the shadows of the Twin Towers, the remnants of an ancient ship.
At the construction site at Ground Zero, a rare find. What we can see is believed to be half of a ship.
Construction halts, and a team of archaeologists rushes to Ground Zero. The principal investigator, Warren Reese.
It was right there, right where the security area is for parking at the World Trade Center.
When Warren arrives, only part of the ship is exposed. Its secrets still hidden under the mud.
The history of this particular vessel might fill in tremendous gaps in our knowledge about the history of New York City itself.
To find out more, Warren's team scans the excavated site with high-accuracy laser technology. Combining the high-resolution 3D data with cutting-edge computer imaging, we can turn back time and drain Ground Zero. To reveal an astonishing subterranean secret. Layers of earth crumble away. "22 feet underground, in the heart of Manhattan. The flattened wreck of a wooden ship. It's 30 feet long, and its wooden structure is roughly hewn.
We'd never seen a vessel just like this one. It was not only rare, it's one of a kind.
What is this ship? And what's it doing beneath the heart of Manhattan? More than 500 yards from the shoreline. To find out, Reese and his team need to learn its age. Taking a closer look inside the wood, they find well-preserved tree rings. They reveal that the timber was felled in 1773 or soon after.
It was like a time capsule, it's a secret time capsule.
In America, the 1770s mean only one thing: revolution.
What we have is a vessel that's been hiding underneath New York City that's from the Revolutionary period.
Back then, New York is home to just 25,000 people. But the quality of its harbor has already made it one of America's most successful ports. Its strategic importance puts New York firmly in the crosshairs of Britain's King George. When the American Revolution begins in 1775. Just a year later, a huge British invasion force drives George Washington's army out of the city. Could this ship have been part of the battle? Going back to the drained wreckage, clues emerge. Beneath the decking, 327 pieces of artillery, including a cannonball and 56 musket balls. Soldiers from one side or another have clearly been on board this ship. Then, in the center of the wreck, Warren Reese's team discovers the smallest of clues.
Now, this button was found in the midships area of the vessel between some frames and some planks, and because of that, we know it was on the ship before it was buried.
The pewter button is stamped with the number 52. It's fallen from the uniform of a soldier from the 52nd Regiment of the British Army.
They were grenadiers, which means they're very aggressive assault troops. Pretty exciting to find this because this ties this ship to a British soldier in New York during the Revolution, a common soldier who's lost their button.
If this ship was used by some of the most fearsome troops in the British Army, what were they using it for? Combining the scanning data with new research by Texas A&M University, we can resurrect the ship. As her original form rises from the dirt, her full size becomes clear, and her striking features. 50 feet long, her beam 18 feet, with the hull of a river craft. Just 4 feet deep and a small keel. This is not an ocean-going vessel. It's specifically designed for use in sheltered coastal waters.
It was able to get into shallow water, into little coves, alongside ships.
A ship that's perfect for operating within New York Harbor and crewed by British grenadiers. Evidence that she could be part of a little-known but brutal story. During the war, British forces ferried many thousands of Americans to a horrifying destination, just 2 miles away, off the shores of Brooklyn.
During the American Revolution, this was known as Wallabout Bay, and it was the most lethal place during the whole revolution for the Americans.
New York City still has its secrets, its dark past, including the most grisly and bloodiest event of the entire Revolutionary War.
As the British try to quell the uprising, they capture thousands of prisoners and ferry them out onto the waters of Wallabout Bay to a place known as Hell Afloat. A flotilla of festering British ships, overcrowded, freezing cold, poorly supplied, and run by brutal guards.
The diseases that swept through just terrorized the men on board.
Most notorious of all, the HMS Jersey.
She would serve as potentially the worst prison ship, floating dungeon in human history.
Warren Reese believes that the World Trade Center ship may play a role in this dark chapter of New York's history.
They needed boats to go back and forth and to bring prisoners out, and this would have been a perfect vessel for that. They would have just stuffed them in there, even if they had to pack them in sitting down. It might carry 100 people on board.
The casualty figures are staggering. Far worse than 9/11. Historians estimate that 11,000 men die on HMS Jersey alone.
Twice as many men died aboard the Jersey as were lost in combat during the entirety of the Revolutionary War. It's unimaginable.
It's a very dark chapter of American history.
One last mystery remains about the British ferryboat. Why was it found under the heart of Manhattan? America finally wins independence. And New York changes fast.
In the years after the American Revolution, New York very much is like a phoenix rising from the ashes, politically and economically.
At its heart, a thriving dock that looks very different from the city of today.
We're in the middle of a modern city here. We're in the lower districts of Manhattan. And about halfway down that block was the original shoreline.
Eager to improve their harbor, New Yorkers build new wharves, extending the island of Manhattan out into the bay. Abandoned in the docks, half sunk in the mud, the old British ferry is simply built around and over. Centuries later, the World Trade Center rises on top of the old dockland. And the ships that had witnessed America's bloody birth. Commerce drives the city's expansion, and for commerce, location is everything. Facing the roaring Atlantic at the mouth of the Hudson River, New York's huge natural harbor is the perfect place for an international port. Miles of shoreline in a protected bay from which an independent America can trade with the world. In the 1800s, more passengers and cargo flow through New York than all other U.S. ports combined.
There were so many sailing vessels coming and going and docking here that observers would describe it as a forest of masts.
But the city's ambition soon outgrows the fabulous harbor provided by nature. Just yards from bustling uptown Manhattan, evidence of an earth-shattering event that reshaped this city. Just how far would New Yorkers go to make their port the greatest on earth? New York Harbor's main entrance is the Verrazzano Narrows. But there's a second gateway to the Atlantic, Long Island Sound. Crucial to sustaining the frenzied flow of commerce. But it's obstructed by a perilous stretch of the East River. Hell Gate. In the 1850s, 1 in 50 ships are devoured here, a terrifying statistic. James Delgado, maritime archaeologist from Search Incorporated, wants to learn more about the dangers of Hell Gate.
This early map is particularly remarkable because it shows us Hell Gate with the positions of a number of rocks marked.
Islands and hidden reefs choke the shipping lane, churning the water into a maelstrom.
This is a challenging, if not dangerous, area to navigate. A gauntlet to be run.
Among the many perils of Hell Gate, one monster looms large and deadly. Flood Rock. 9 acres of stone lurking just beneath the surface. Right at the heart of Hell Gate. Today, the channel is still dangerous.
The major obstacle was basically right in the middle of the road, right off of here.
But there's no sign of flood rock above the water. Does the ship-devouring monster lie beneath the surface? James takes to the water.
Okay, sounds good.
This is one of the most notorious stretches of water on the New York waterfront. What you would have been faced with is all this fast-moving water, and it's not just moving in one direction, it's going back and forth, it's swirling around rocks. You sail through, you lose the wind, and suddenly that movement of water drags you right into the teeth.
In search of flood rock, the team from NOAA scans Hellgate with multi-beam sonar, firing sound waves into the murky depths. The return signal records the shape of the features beneath.
This is a real-time image of the bottom, and you can see all the rubble.
Wow.
Using the 3D multi-beam data and the latest computer visualization technology, it's now possible to pull the plug on the entire harbor, to reveal a jaw-dropping sight. Icons of the city as never seen before. As the water recedes from the East River, the remains of flood rock should come into view. But there's not a trace of the beast that is shown in the old charts. 9 acres of rock have vanished. How? Buried in the archives, an incredible story of New York's self-confidence and ambition.
This 1848 chart by the U.S. Coast Survey is actually a working document. It was never published. This is for an engineer to figure out how best to start dealing with this. How do we pull these teeth to make this a smoother ride through?
Backed by wealthy New York merchants, the city fathers make a decision. The future of the city is at stake. Flood rock has got to go.
It is the beginning of an age in which nothing was deemed impossible if enough ingenuity, engineering, and perhaps money was put behind it, as human beings work to reshape the planet to their purposes.
James discovers how the city's engineers planned to do it. By attacking the problem from beneath. First, they sink a 70-foot shaft into the heart of the island. Over 9 long years, miners dig 4 miles of tunnels and drill 15,000 boreholes. And in them, they place a staggering 150 tons of explosives.
The Hellgate work is an epic moment in the history of civil engineering. This is a moment in which technology will triumph over nature.
On October the 10th, 1885, 50,000 people flocked to New York's East River.
Everybody's waiting for the big show.
Flood rock is primed with explosives, and the detonator is pushed. Seven million cubic feet of pulverized rock flies up into the skies over New York City.
The greatest explosion, not only that New York has seen, but that the world has seen up to that time.
And when the spray clears, flood rock is history, leaving the riverbed looking like a gravel pit.
If you really want to think about how New Yorkers have reconfigured and reshaped their entire environment, both on land and in water, I think the word chutzpah is perfect for that.
With its second entrance now secure, New York's shipping business increases at an ever faster rate. Cargo ships move sugar, spices, cotton, machinery and construction materials. all to feed America's booming economy.
New York expands dramatically in the 19th century. It's becoming the industrial and commercial heart of the United States.
By the 1880s, the city's population is more than 1 million. And its waters are getting crowded, dangerously so. In the wild Atlantic, just a few miles beyond New York Harbor, what can one strange offshore wreck tell us of the pace of trade through the waters of New York? And the peril facing those pursuing the American dream. Before daybreak, on March 14th, 1886, the SS Oregon is nearing the end of a 3,000-mile voyage from England. Transporting her cargo and over 600 passengers through the dark approach to New York Harbor. It's a calm night. Just 60 miles stand between her and her final destination. But at first light, a lookout from Fire Island Signal Station reports her masts drifting off course. Moments later, the Oregon disappears and never arrives in New York. What happens to her and all the people on board out in the darkness?
As flat as this seems, this is a dangerous section of ocean. There are many disasters that happen within the reach of this light's beams. But every once in a while, there comes a big disaster in which a large ship is lost.
For over 130 years, Oregon has lain shrouded by the Atlantic.
The waters off the New York coast are dark, cold, and often murky.
The ocean has concealed her secrets. But now, that's changing. Off the southern shore of Fire Island, the Ferdinand R. Hassler goes in search of wreckage.
You are clear to turn around and make another pass.
For hundreds of years, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Coast Survey has been charting and recharting these waters.
We're about 12 nautical miles south of Fire Island, and we're about to go right on top of her.
Multi-beam scanners in the ship's hull emit sonar pulses.
And we use this technology to very accurately and precisely map features on the ocean floor. Oh, wow, there it is. Look at that, that's awesome.
Based upon this detailed three-dimensional data, we can bring the Oregon and her story back into the light. First, a towering structure of tangled metal. The water receding further, the Oregon as never seen before. She's taken a beating from the ocean. Her insides are exposed to the elements, allowing us to examine what type of ship she is. Though her masts were seen from ashore, they must have been supplementary. Oregon isn't a sail ship. In fact, she represents a revolution in shipping. She is a steamer. Beneath her 4-story high steam engine, the remains of 9 boilers, each 16 feet wide.
This thing is a behemoth. With so many fires going, that it's consuming massive amounts of coal.
And towards her stern, a huge screw propeller, 24 feet wide. This is the corpse of an athlete. A ship built with one thing in mind: speed. But why? The answer is part of the DNA of New York City itself: immigrants.
Folks from all around the world that came for opportunity and for this dream that New York City was.
More than 70% of immigrants bound for America arrive in New York.
New York is the gateway. As Lincoln said, it was the front door.
By the late 1800s, 650,000 immigrants arrive every year, and up to 20,000 boats a year maneuver through the harbor, and everyone is in a hurry.
Is a time of rampant capitalism. Great fortunes are being made. Profit is everything.
The waters are just alive with vessels.
Faster ships mean more trade and bigger profits. Time is money. The quest for profit leads to an extraordinary technological race to build ships that will cross the Atlantic faster and faster.
The early days of ocean steam are cutthroat. You have entrepreneurs who are battling it out on the ocean. By the 1870s and into the 1880s, that's when you begin to see the birth of truly magnificent ocean steamers. Greyhounds of the sea, leviathans.
The British-operated Geon Line builds the Oregon in 1881 to boost its New York Express service. And she's cutting edge.
It has the largest steam engine yet put into one of these ships.
Consuming over 200 tons of coal a day, her boilers generate upwards of 12,000 horsepower, driving the huge screw propeller that thrusts Oregon forward at an astonishing 18 knots. In April 1884, she crosses the Atlantic in under 6.5 days, slashing 13 hours off the record.
It's something that nobody had thought could be done.
Oregon claims the prize and earns the nickname Greyhound of the Atlantic. So what took down such a powerful machine? Returning to the drained wreck, there's a clue, disguised by decades of decay. On her port side, a section of the hull is more crumpled than anywhere else. Something must have ripped a hole right here. But what? The degradation means it's impossible to tell from the wreckage alone. An article from the New York Times holds the answer. Oregon is a victim of New York's heaving waterways.
The risk of getting into a collision is actually shockingly high.
Combining this research with the evidence from the drained wreck, we can piece together the final moments. At 4:30 in the morning, Oregon is bound for New York under a full head of steam.
It's a dark night. They're lining up and heading towards the port. They can see the lights along the Long Island shore. The Fire Island light is brilliantly lit.
A light appears on her port side.
It's another ship heading right for them, and it strikes them dramatically on the side. Then the other ship backs off and disappears. The ocean is pouring into the heart of Oregon.
Over 8 frantic hours, nearby boats rescue every passenger on board the Oregon. Their dreams of a new life in America still intact. But the mighty Oregon has suffered a fatal blow.
This greyhound of the Atlantic has been gored and sunk just off the entrance to the city.
While Oregon never makes it to port, thousands more liners do. Ellis Island opens in 1892. 12 million new Americans pour through its halls. Ocean liners flood the harbor, beckoning a golden age. In just a century, New York's population grows from 60,000 to 3.5 million. By 1900, it's the largest city in the Western Hemisphere, drawing the eyes of the world, including those who would try and take her down. 40 miles from New York, off the shores of Long Island, what sank this giant? And how does her sinking reveal New York's vulnerability at the dawn of the 20th century? In the summer of 1917, America is at war. Transatlantic convoys carrying troops and supplies to Europe are key to the Allies' hopes of success. Protected by warships like the USS San Diego. 500 feet long, over 13,000 tons, armor-plated with 40 guns of up to 8 inches. And multiple watertight bulkheads to make her unsinkable. On July 19th, 1918, she's approaching New York to pick up a convoy. At 11:05 a.m., just outside the harbor, she is rocked by a huge explosion.
Within 20 minutes, the ship had sunk. San Diego was the only major U.S. Navy warship lost in the Great War. It happens to lie just a few miles from the coast of New York.
So what happened? A team from the U.S. Navy has reopened the case, led by archaeologist Alexis Katsanis.
The question has lingered for over a century. What sank San Diego?
To find out, Navy divers explore the wreckage of this sunken warrior. But it's impossible to see the whole picture through the murky waters. Working with the University of Delaware, Alexis deploys three-dimensional scanning equipment to map San Diego's structure on the seafloor.
This project is the first time we're getting comprehensive remote sensing data.
Combining this new data with the latest computer imaging technology, we can do something impossible before now. Reveal, in perfect detail, the wreck of a U.S. casualty of the Great War. The San Diego comes into the light for the first time in 100 years. It's the beautiful, sleek shape of her 500-foot hull that appears first. The steel structure is in remarkable condition for her age. Apart from this, towards her stern, a section of the hull that's damaged. This is the blast site, eroded by decades of decay. But it appears to be below the waterline. If something hit the ship, it was beneath the surface. The team studies the historical records, There's no suggestion that engine malfunction or onboard ordnance caused the blast, reinforcing the view that it could have been caused by something more sinister. Advances in technology mean German U-boats can now cross the Atlantic.
This is a new era where submarine warfare is taking over.
The war was brought to New York shores.
By the 1900s, New York is the planet's busiest port. An irresistible target for the Imperial German Navy.
If you're an enemy of the United States, what is a more symbolic target than New York City?
The team wonders if a torpedo from a U-boat could have caused the explosion. To answer the question, they calculate the original size of the blast hole.
What damage is related to that original point of impact and that original explosion?
They find a report from a Navy diver who visited the wreck in 1918.
He says he was along the bottom on the port side around the number 4 smokestack.
He estimates the cavity to be just 5 feet wide.
Well, that corresponds to being right below the armor belt, which makes sense.
Using this data, we can reconstruct the original blast hole. Could it have been caused by a torpedo? The team models the damage that World War I torpedo payloads cause, and get a surprise.
It became rather evident that the torpedoes were simply too large of a weapon. They carried too large of a charge and would have resulted in a hole that was far larger than 5 or 6 feet.
They wonder if it was a mine. Incredibly, archives from the German government reveal U-boats were ordered to lay mines outside New York Harbor.
They knew that it was an important area for shipping for the United States and allies.
But they discover standard German mines, known as Type 4, also inflict a blast hole larger than 5 feet. Then, a key insight. By 1918, Germany is running short of explosives.
The Germans, by the end of the war, were using diminished charges.
And allowing for the reduced charge in a Type 4 mine, it produces a blast hole close to 5 feet wide. It appears to be a match. San Diego was almost certainly hit by a small German mine. But there's another question. The hole is still tiny. How could it sink a 500-foot-long ship in just 20 minutes and flip her upside down? "40 miles from New York, the drained wreck of the San Diego reveals another piece of the puzzle.
Understanding the weapon is only one part of a larger picture. We want to understand the whole sequence of events that occurred and how the ship sank.
Watertight bulkheads and doors are specifically designed to stop the spread of water and keep this warship upright. But somehow, San Diego turned upside down. She sank through just 100 feet of water. Not enough for her to roll on the descent. She must have capsized at the surface. How did a small hole in a watertight section of this ship leave her lying prone on the seafloor? Alexis and his colleagues are sure that water must have penetrated further into her hull.
We needed to understand how this happened. How did we get to the point where instead of simply sinking, the ship turned in on herself?
Analysis shows that even with substantial flooding, San Diego wouldn't capsize. Baffled, the team studies San Diego's structure, looking for signs of weakness.
So here we can see a plan of the gun deck of USS San Diego.
But plans are no match for inspecting a real warship. A contemporary of the San Diego, although a few years older, is the cruiser, USS Olympia. The oldest steel warship still afloat. Examining her internal structure, the team makes a breakthrough.
Then we realized that the fact that she was coal-powered was critical and crucial to our determination of how she capsized.
Coal, stored on deck, has to be delivered to the engine rooms below.
So this chute would have been similar to like the one we would find on San Diego. It would have allowed coal to be deposited all the way through to the coal bunkers. And even though you can close it, it's still not watertight.
This weakness hadn't been clear on the San Diego's plans.
There were additional entry points we were not factoring in.
The watertight bulkheads prevent seawater from flooding the entire hull. But these chutes and a network of vents gave it another route.
And so water coming in through the gun deck would have permeated through these chutes into the coal bunkers, and from there onto the engine rooms and the boiler rooms and throughout the vessel.
By examining San Diego's wreckage and piecing together the clues, we're able to tell her complete story for the very first time. The USS San Diego is headed for New York. The horizon is clear, but there's danger lurking beneath the water. A German U-boat has laid a minefield. San Diego brushes against one.
Water spewed into the air, and it started then flooding the engineering and boiler room spaces.
As she lists, water pours onto the gun deck from the port side. Rapidly penetrating the ship via the coal chutes and vents, tipping her further.
Within a few moments, she had capsized and was on her way to the bottom.
All but 6 of her 1,100-strong crew survived. But San Diego sinks to her watery grave, just miles from the heart of New York City. A heavyweight victim of a calculated attack. Draining New York City reveals stories of conflict, immigration, and ruthless ambition. Today, the spirit and success of this remarkable city still invites enemy attack, to which New York gives a familiar reply.
Remnants of a lost city, buried in the sand.
Finding anything in that environment, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack.
This is the front paw of the Sphinx. What's surprising is the size of it.
Giant statues and the ruins of a pharaoh's palace. But this is not the Egyptian desert. It's California.
The sets were the biggest that had ever been built.
When you drain Hollywood,
this is Hollywood history.
Nothing is what it seems.
This is in phenomenal shape. You'll never see anything like this anywhere else.
It was beautiful.
But could we save it? This is a story that beggars belief. It's bizarre, it's huge, And once I'd heard it, I got so excited. There was no question. I really wanted to be involved. I've always loved old Hollywood movies. As a photographer, I've always really loved black and white. It can be so expressive. But I'd never thought I'd get drawn into a search for a lost film set. The film was The Ten Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille. The classic silent movie made in 1923. Everything about the film was gigantic. The budget was an unheard of amount. The set for the master shot of the Exodus of the children of Israel was huge. Nothing like it had been done before. But then, according to local legend, DeMille blew up the set after he'd finished filming, and all trace of it mysteriously disappeared. Until one night in 1982, two film students come across an intriguing clue. Bruce Cardozo and Peter Brosnan were having a drink and talking about the old movies. Bruce had been reading the autobiography of Cecil B. DeMille, and he'd found a line which really intrigued him. If 1,000 years from now, archaeologists dig beneath the sands of Guadalupe, the sphinxes they will find there were buried when we had dismantled our huge set at the gates of the Pharaoh's city. Peter got really excited. This built in his mind to become an obsession. Was the lost film set still there? Fired up by the idea of finding the set, Peter and Bruce set off to the Guadalupe Dunes, which is 160 miles northwest of Hollywood, up on the central coast of California. Their hearts must have dropped because those dunes stretch for 18-20 miles up the coast. Finding any semblance of a film set in that environment, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack.
Refusing to give up, they decide to try again 2 years later.
And that's when I got involved. Peter and Bruce invited me to be the official photographer. And in February 1985, we went back up to the site. I was so excited. It was going to be a really exciting ride. Peter located a local rancher, and he told us he used to drive cattle across the dunes from time to time. And the winds are relentless, coming in off the ocean. And he told us all of those dunes move, except one, the big one. Because the big one is full of stuff. There was something buried in the sand there. But was this DeMille's set, or was it something else? So we walked up to the crest of the big one. I couldn't believe my eyes. Spread out before us was this field of pottery shards, white and orange plaster, pieces of heavy lumber, coils of rusting steel wire, bottle tops, bits of glassware, and it spread for miles. It just kept going. I was getting goosebumps. The size, the scale, it was huge. This was the biggest set of the biggest film by the biggest filmmaker. This was Hollywood history. But how much of the set was left?
The movies are my life. I've lived life with the movies and through the movies. I got into movies first when I was in elementary school. After school, I watched the classics of the Hollywood cinema. The films, of course, were in black and white in those days. wonderful dialogue, glamorous stars, fabulous stories. Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments was a real landmark in cinema history. By the mid-1920s, Cecil B. DeMille was the most powerful director at the biggest of all studios, Paramount. DeMille starts as an actor, is interested in writing plays. When he reached Hollywood, really kind of reinvented himself as a film director. He would carry a riding crop and wear riding boots and a beret and would bark out orders. In many ways, the stereotype we now have of the old-time movie director comes from Cecil B. DeMille.
We were only looking at tiny parts of the film set. We needed to know how much was left. So Peter managed to get a radar specialist who had been involved in the development of ground-penetrating radar. The results were just phenomenal. 23 anomalies. Things buried in the dune. And on the very last day, we found something really magical. Very close to the surface, where the wind had blown away a lot of sand. We found eye, nose, lips, a face from one of the 20-foot-high statues guarding the sides of the gates of the Pharaoh's city. We had found DeMille's film set. But this was just the start. Could we save it? And that's when the challenges really began. The dunes are a very protected area. We weren't allowed to dig anything. 2 species of bird that use it as a nesting area. Snowy plover lays its eggs on the ground. The permits, you can't disturb the nesting sites. No vehicles on the dune. There was a minefield of it's very difficult to There are no mechanical devices that are allowed. We got close to giving up several times.
For more than 2 decades, the team wrestles with setbacks. Finally, in 2012, a generous donor funds a group of skilled archaeologists with the expertise to work around the fragile dunes. And the excavation of DeMille's lost city begins.
I have been working as an historical archaeologist for a lot of years. When it was suggested that I might be able to work on the Lost City project, I said, absolutely, let's go for it. The primary goal was to locate one of the Sphinx and to preserve it as a legacy of Hollywood. When we started, we found very small pieces, as if it had been blown up.
DeMille was very conscious of the idea that he didn't want to leave those sets standing around so other filmmakers could dash in there and make little quickie films. And he supposedly paid to have the sets blown up, and they were lost in the mists of time.
We could only find bits and pieces. The question was, could we find anything of DeMille's set still intact?
A team of archaeologists is searching for the remains of a massive 1920s movie set.
There is Cecil B. DeMille's set for the film The Ten Commandments. Nearing the end of the first season, we made a series of fascinating discoveries. Various facial elements of the Sphinx, an eye, nose, lips, and one of the paws. But it was badly damaged. Then we found elements of a second Sphinx still intact, primarily the haunches.
One of the exciting finds was this makeup tin showing that people did use makeup, pigment. It would have closed something like this and opened like this. It looks like there's still remnants of some of the grease on the interior. This is a Eastman Kodak film canister. The EAS here is the identifying marker that let us know it is a film canister from 1923.
In the Ten Commandments, in the great sequence of the Exodus, we have shots that are done in Technicolor with two primary colors. DeMille is one of the very, very first major filmmakers to put Technicolor sequences into his film. And they're really quite striking.
As exciting as these discoveries were, nothing really prepared us for what we found next.
One morning I was walking around the movie set site, and there was a piece of statuary sticking out of the sand, and it appeared to be a hind paw. We decided to focus on excavating that sphinx.
So far we've got an ear, hopefully a cheek, and we think there's a forehead seam somewhere in there, and we're really hoping the face is intact. It's insanely exciting.
This set was an amazing undertaking. DeMille had to create everything from scratch in somewhat kind of harsh circumstances, on sand dunes, in bad weather.
Looks like we have virtually the whole thing.
It's incredible.
More than I expected.
You'll never see anything like this again, ever, anywhere else.
The set was 800 feet long. It had 25-ton sphinxes laid out in a double phalanx out from the gates of the pharaoh's city. And this one seemed much more intact.
The next challenge became how to remove it and preserve it. DeMille's set was created of plaster framed around wooden framework, and as soon as you exposed it to the air, the chemistry began to change. And it began to crumble and to fall apart.
I never would have thought I'd be digging up Egyptian statuary in the dunes of Southern California. I'm a building restoration artist in Hollywood, working on historic buildings, movie palaces for 20 years. I was brought into the project because of my plaster restoration experience. It's the scary part, because I don't want to go too deep. We tried various different ways to stabilize the plaster in the field. We used B72, acrylic resin. We brushed this on and used gauze. It wasn't working out very well. The plaster is so soft.
This is detritus off there.
It can be damaged just by a brush or your hand, and the gauze wouldn't actually hold the piece together. So we improvised. We found that using expandable insulation foam, commonly used to insulate houses, was a great tool in the field as support to get larger pieces out of the sand.
After having worked the last few years with just pieces here and there, to see the whole reveal is just incredible. When we rolled it over, it was probably the most incredible experience I've ever had on any site. We exposed the other side of the face, and the paint on it was just fresh, it had just seconds been exposed. just incredible. It was beautiful.
The enormity of this project gives me goosebumps today.
The local museum in Guadalupe now has a dedicated display, and the Sphinx that we excavated is now a centerpiece of the Dune Center's exhibits. But we still had a big question. What would it have been like to be on DeMille's movie set in 1923?
The scale of the production on the Ten Commandments was colossal. 500 carpenters, 500 painters, 400 set decorators, 1,200 electricians and gardeners. The set itself was more than 100 feet tall. The materials required were enormous. Over 500,000 feet of lumber, 25,000 pounds of nails, 75 miles of cable, 300 tons of plaster. There were 500 tons of elaborate sculptures, over 20 sphinxes. There were 4 massive statues of the pharaoh Ramses, each 35 feet tall and weighing 39 tons. Cast and crew numbered at least 3,500 men, women, and children. A Camp DeMille was set up where they lived under canvas in 500 tents for weeks at a time. A single lunch required 7,500 sandwiches, 2,500 apples and oranges, and 400 gallons of coffee. "5,000 animals were used on the set. Photoplay magazine called it the greatest theatrical spectacle in history.
Of course, there was one final twist. What did DeMille do with the set when he was done? The local story was that the set had been blown up, but the evidence didn't support it.
While walking the site, we found segments of wire such as this. We know it's a very windy area. Is this a clue?
Now that we're up here, you can see that the wind is so strong that when it blows, it could tear down virtually anything.
And you would have needed industrial cable such as this to stabilize the large statuary and keep it standing upright.
All the film crew had to do to destroy the set was to cut the cables. And the winds did the rest and blew the set over. And as time passed, buried the site, so it looks as it does today.
The Ten Commandments is a huge hit and becomes Paramount's highest-grossing film for the next 25 years. It was the dawn of a new era, the profitable blockbuster. And throughout the 1920s, Hollywood boomed.
But of course, we all know this is going to end. In 1929, the stock market is going to crash. The United States is going to go from the Roaring '20s into the Great Depression. By 1933, half of the Hollywood majors were in bankruptcy, and most of the rest were approaching bankruptcy.
Everyone was terrified. Would Hollywood make it? Would the film industry survive?
Despite the Great Depression, one industry in Los Angeles is finding new ways to survive on land and sea.
There are more than 1,000 shipwrecks that lie off the coast of California. It becomes a passion for me to investigate, search out, find them. The ocean has been my life all my life. Started diving with my dad when I was really young in the early 70s, where I grew up, a coastal town in California. I wanted to visit the deeper wrecks, so it required me taking some technical rebreather training. During that training, I came across something really amazing. Something I've never expected to see. This wreck is about 10 miles off the coast of Long Beach. It's 135 to 140 feet, which is pretty deep. It's pretty dark and you don't see anything for a long time. And then out of the gloom becomes this huge shape. You really feel the adrenaline rush at that time. I was just thinking, man, it is huge. Bigger than anything I had dove on before. We realized we were on the stern section. And then we realized that there was only half a ship there. I was thinking, where's the rest of the ship? Where's the other half? It was strange, intriguing. After that dive, I had a lot of unanswered questions. What kind of ship was she? Why did she sink? And what is she doing here, just 10 miles off of Long Beach?
I'm a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy Reserve. When I was active duty, I served aboard 2 warships. Now I own a marine exploration company, and we go and search for lost ship and aircraft wrecks.
I work with Kevin as a spatial scientist. We use remote sensing and photogrammetry to study coastal environments. So I specialize in meteorology, oceanography, and even things like shipwrecks. To create a photogrammetry model, we take the video using an ROV, an underwater robot. And we extract thousands of photographs and put them together to create a 3D model. We can start to see things maybe we wouldn't have seen diving underwater. The question is, what will it show us? The cool thing about this photogrammetry model is that we can manipulate the wreck and look at it from a bird's eye view or turn it around.
That is really cool.
You can see this wreck has been down here a long time. You can see some of the growth on portions of the wreck.
Can we zoom in on this little area right here?
Sure.
Right here. Well, look at that. It's really clear. There's a gun mount right there.
Oh, yeah.
Wow, look at that. Can we go up to like the bow section?
Yeah.
Right there, that's the torpedo tube. I'm at a loss for words for that, really. So this clearly looks like a warship, but what kind? And what is she doing here? During my next dive, we started exploring further, and more than 100 feet away on the bottom, we find the other section of the ship. I was very confused as to why the 2 sections of the ship were so far apart. Then we found something we never expected to ever see on a ship like this. pieces of wood attached to the superstructure. Timber on a warship, it's a metal ship. There's no reason or place for timber. Why was that there? We started investigating the mangled wreckage area, and there was a lot of metal that was pushed outward. I'd never seen anything like that before. We started diving back to the back part of the wreck, and we saw the same evidence. Here's this massive warship blown in two pieces on the ocean floor. Indications of a huge explosion. And there had been no U.S. destroyers sunk off the coast of California in either World War I or World War II. So what caused that?
So this is where the break is. Let's get a good angle here. You can really see that the metal is being pushed out and not in.
If it was to be hit by the torpedo, the metal would have been pushed in. So it wasn't the victim of an attack of an enemy submarine. It just didn't make sense.
A mysterious 1,000-ton warship lies wrecked just off the coast of Long Beach, California. But how and why did it sink?
I needed to go back and do some more reading. As I was doing some more research, I finally found something that answered my questions. An article in the Los Angeles Times from February 22nd, 1933. It talked about a warship that had been spotted off the coast of Long Beach. It was a U.S. naval vessel, the USS Moody, Clemson-class destroyer, sub hunter, built in Squantum, Massachusetts in 1919. Everything about her seemed to match the ship I'd been diving on. She never saw any wartime action. What's happened here? In fact, MGM Studios bought her for about $35,000 to use in a World War I movie, Hell Below. The ship that we'd been swimming on all this time had been a Hollywood movie set.
Hell Below is an MGM picture from 1933, a pretty big budget film with a real all-star cast. Robert Montgomery, Robert Young. It's a tragic World War I story, but it's also got crazy comedy with Jimmy Durante. It also has romantic scenes, and it contains this wonderful battle at sea.
You know, the wood I found on the wreck started to make sense. I knew it wasn't part of the original vessel. It turns out it was a set dressing. MGM producers used timber to disguise this old U.S. Navy destroyer so it looked like a World War I German warship.
And then they blew it up and sunk it on camera for the film.
It's not easy to sink a real warship like this. So how did they do it?
So if we take the photogrammetry model and we cross-reference it to the blueprints of this destroyer, you can see right away where the vessel would have broken in half.
It broke right there between those two boilers, 3 and 4.
Mm-hmm.
So what the model makes clear is that the explosive charges were set in the boiler room. This first set of explosives was designed to create a massive explosion to simulate torpedo hits, and severed the ship in 2 hull sections. Demolition engineers placed a second set of charges in each section of the ship to destroy the bulkheads, flooding them with seawater. The Moody eventually went down, giving filmmakers a rare opportunity to actually film a sinking ship. It was ingenious. It was a spectacular scene.
Turns out the USS Moody wasn't the only ship that Hollywood used to make movies in the 20s and the 30s. About 25 miles west, there's the wrecks of at least 9 other ships that the studios used to make different movies. In fact, so many ships were used as film sets that the actors started calling them the Hollywood Navy.
Of course, with the stock market crash in 1929, the Hollywood majors had to completely reorganize themselves to survive. Buying up an old ship and then sinking it, it was worth it. Getting the most bang for their buck, putting great stuff up on the screen to impress their audience. This sequence cost MGM $35,000, but it's another example of MGM's savvy management during the Great Depression.
It is creative gambles like these that keep audiences flocking to theaters despite the economic depression.
Gambling was the lifeblood of Hollywood's movie moguls. Where there's a lot of money, there are going to be people there who want to separate you from that money. Bookies, racketeers, gangsters, they all flooded into Hollywood like bees to honey. They knew that there was a big pot. They couldn't wait.
Back in the 1920s, Hollywood wasn't just the entertainment hub of the world. It was California's crime capital.
Somewhere out there, about 3 miles out on the ocean floor, is a remnant from LA's past. A wrecked ship called the Falcone. She belonged to my great-grandfather. I read a lot about the Falcone, about how she sank under mysterious circumstances. I really just want to find out what actually happened. My great-grandfather, Jack Dragna, was born in Corleone, Sicily, and came to Los Angeles in 1915.
He was the mob boss in Los Angeles for about a quarter century. He did business with Al Capone, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and had a little spat with Mickey Cohen.
In 1928, he and several investors purchased an old fishing barge, and they turned her into a floating casino. But less than 2 years later, the Falcone sank after a mysterious fire.
I've always wondered, was this an accident or did something shady happen?
Shipwrecks, sunken cities, sunken trains, sunken aircraft. If it sank, I probably dove on it. Now I want to find out what happened to J. Michael's great-granddaddy's ship. But shipwrecks don't give up their secrets easily, and certainly the Falcone is no different. I'm hoping we can find some signs of what actually started the fire. But I don't think it's going to be easy. The wreck is 72 feet down. The ship itself has collapsed. More of a massive jumble of timbers than a ship now. And it's also really overgrown. To try to figure out what happened to the Falcone, we have to get to know her a little better. It's tough to see her underwater, but easier if we can make a 3D model of her.
Oh, wow. This is wonderful.
It really is amazing that there's this much structural detail still visible. Originally, she wasn't actually a barge at all, but something much more impressive. The Falcone was just a beautiful ship. Built in Orange, Texas in 1919. It was a barkentine schooner rig, and then the foremast square rigged.
Amazing.
It had its fair share of problems. In 1923, it was coming out of New Orleans and hit a hurricane, completely dismasted there. Then it was towed 3,000 miles to Los Angeles, and that's when your great-granddaddy bought it. For him, a dismasted ship was an ingenious solution to a problem.
In 1920, a new law is introduced banning the sale of alcohol. But while gambling and drinking are illegal on land, it's a different story at sea.
Racketeers, they're thinking, there's got to be a way around this. Somebody had the bright idea of a barge. How about this palace out in the waters beyond the reach of law enforcement? It is a brilliant idea. You could gamble, you could have prostitutes, you could have liquor. They just didn't see any downside to it. The Falcone was one of these ships, and they were kind of like Sin City afloat.
By combining all the scan data, we can get a pretty good picture of what the Falcone looks like. Inside, these casino ships were total Hollywood glitz. This is what the dance pavilion on the top deck was like.
I didn't realize it was that big.
They had a 125-foot dance floor, a 7-piece orchestra, fine dining.
It looks like we're below deck here, gambling parlor.
This is the actual casino. On the lower deck, roulette wheels, craps, poker tables, slot machines, and chuck-a-luck.
They put a lot of money into making this thing well equipped for gamblers.
Money was no object. It's all pretty fancy, but the gambling tables, the furnishings, it's all combustible. The ship's wooden hull was made watertight with rope soaked in tar. The Falcone was just a giant tinderbox waiting to go up in flames.
Divers are trying to establish the cause of the fire that sank a Prohibition-era gambling ship that lies wrecked 10 miles off the Californian coast.
How'd it go?
I think I saw a picture of your great-grandmother.
That's terrible. I can still see all the wood planking. It's like a lumber yard.
Did you guys find any fire damage?
We could see a little bit, but not much.
There's nothing there that identifies the cause of the fire or the sinking.
I think I'm about as close to the Falcone as I'm ever gonna get. But I still don't feel any closer to solving the mystery of why she sank.
If we look carefully at the wreck again, we can see that all that's left is the lower portion of the hull. The ship above the waterline is completely gone. And that can mean only one thing. The fire was so intense that it burnt through the Falcone right down to the waterline. Most of the ship's timbers were turned to carbon and the ocean just washed them away. All the wood on the ocean floor is from below the water. The fire couldn't reach it. That's why it shows no trace of burning.
I've managed to unearth a lot, but there's still the question of how the fire got started. There are a lot of theories about what happened that night, about how she caught fire, and one of them is that it was an insurance scam. You know, the owners were trying to make a quick buck.
So I did some more research.
Falcone.
And I was actually shocked to learn they weren't insured. they lost something like 115,000 in the ship alone.
Well, there was also talk about a rivalry with the owners of the competing vessel, and that was the Joanna Smith, and with the Monfalcone's investors. Berkeley Daily Gazette, May 22nd, 1930. 5 men hijacked a water taxi and forced it over to the Monfalcone. Several shots were fired, and then the raiders took possession of the vessel. It would not be outlandish for someone to set a fire to take out the competition. So, was it sabotage? Well, survivors and eyewitnesses thought it was just a simple accident. A leaky generator, neglected maintenance. I mean, even the crew thought the ship was an accident just waiting to happen. Reports say the fire began below the decks. Inside the engine room, there was a leaky oil line. Spark from the generator ignited unsecured cans of gasoline. And in no time, it was all over.
The fire on the Monfalcone, was it an accident? Was it deliberately set? I don't think we'll ever know for sure.
The crime wave of the Prohibition years sees a whole new era for Hollywood. Pulp fiction and crime movies thrived, and gangsters and femme fatales became the new stars.
During those tumultuous early decades of Hollywood, the boom of the 1920s, the bust of the Great Depression, Hollywood had to continually reinvent itself. It had to continually come up with new ideas and new genres, which included the biblical epic, the film noir and gangster pictures, and of course the war film. Unlike many other industries during the Great Depression, Hollywood was able to survive and continued to entertain the world into the second half of the 20th century and beyond.
They shot him in the back. Shot him in the back.
From a young age, I was obsessed with the Wild West.
I'm only gonna tell you once more.
Stories of dusty streets and the gunslingers, cowboys and Indians, good and bad, rags to riches.
Oh, Jim!
But there are lots of people that have a stake in this story that are totally ignored.
What really happened at the Battle of the Little Bighorn?
We use a crime scene technique. We use the physical evidence, the forensic science.
I'm one of the last survivors who has a story about this, and I'm passing it on.
What can a boat buried in a Nebraskan field reveal about the pioneers who headed west?
This is not a little 3x3 test excavation. This is filled with the stuff that made America.
We said that it was like Christmas every day. There wasn't one of anything. There were hundreds of everything.
And how do the crumbling remains of a ghost town uncover new truths about life in the Wild West?
It's time to update the outdated narratives and to challenge the stereotypes. The real story is much more interesting than what Hollywood will tell you.
Sam Corbino was a businessman in Omaha, and Jesse Purcell was a pilot. But they were also treasure hunters. They took a flex gate magnetometer and they started looking in an area of several square miles on and surrounding DeSoto National Wildlife Refuge. Pretty much like radar. It sends out a signal, and when it finds a metallic object, it sends a signal back to the instrument. Just a few days later, they found several of these magnetic anomalies. They knew that they had hit a stash of artifacts of some kind.
Whatever it is, it lies just half a mile from the Missouri River.
This first picture is obviously one of the drilling rigs where they put down some test holes. Well, in one of them, up came fragments of boots, fragments of broken glass, the smell of alcohol. They had a lot of newspaper people out there all the time. They obviously were fascinated with the idea that they had found something pertaining to the frontier and wanted to know what it was. They stripped the overburden off as best they could. The problem was that being below water table, the water wanted to flood the hole. Water, water everywhere. I'm a dry land archaeologist, and dealing with something like this was not something I was familiar with. I was curator of collections and research at the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology at the University of New Mexico when I was visited by the guys overseeing the project. And they said, "How would you like a job?" Well, I was a teaching fellow making $8,000 a year and starving to death, and that sounded pretty good because they offered me $11,500 with a promotion. I was talking to my mother about my new job, and she said, "You don't know anything about that." And I said, "No, but I'm going to learn fast."
In April 1969, Ron Switzer joins the excavation team to preserve whatever they find.
Well, that's one of the 500-horse diesel pumps that we were using to pump water out of the ground. And this is when we finally knew that we had a boat.
Digging further, they look for clues about the type of vessel they found.
The superstructure above the deck was gone, of course. So all that was left was the deck and some of the heavy machinery, spokes that contained paddle wheels, steam boilers. We pretty much knew we had a steamboat then. That's the bow of the boat there. Yeah, that's the bow. Over time, the Missouri changed its course, and the riverbed became a field. The boat was found 18 feet below water table in a cut-off meander of the Missouri River. Essentially, it was just entombed in mud. So the problem was, of course, trying to identify it, and we didn't know where it was bound for.
Between the 1850s and the 1930s, somewhere around 400 steamboats sank on the Missouri River. There were quite a few boats that actually sank in this general area. It was pretty notorious for sinking boats. So they really wouldn't know which boat they had found until they had excavated it and found proof. Once they finally saw the decking, they had to figure out a way to get the mud off of it.
If you've never experienced Missouri River mud, you don't know what mud is.
They actually found the stern bilge hatch, so they started pulling artifacts out from there. And eventually, they found a soap crate. And on the top of the crate had been hand stenciled, "Stores Bertrand."
And it was brought into the lab, and everybody celebrated, and we knew then that we had the steamboat Bertrand.
The Bertrand steamed from St. Louis and was headed to Fort Benton in the Montana Territory. And that was the very last outpost at the end of the Missouri River. We know from the newspaper accounts that at 3 o'clock on April 1st, 1865, it sank. The Civil War was just winding down. Within a few weeks, Abraham Lincoln would be assassinated. So it was a very turbulent period in American history, a time of massive territorial expansion and human movement.
When the cargo began to be recovered, we didn't know how much there was, but there were tens of thousands of artifacts. So then we had a new problem. There was so much of it. We had to keep them wet. We had to get them into a temperature-controlled environment if we could, or we were going to lose that cargo. There was just no question about it. Well, this brings back memories. That's me, trying to decide what to do with that cargo as it came off the boat by the truckload.
Within 9 months, Ron Switzer's team preserves 500,000 artifacts from the steamboat Bertrand.
Ron gets so many extra bonus points in my book because these steamboat wrecks, we've excavated so few of them for a reason. This is not a little 3x3 test excavation. This is backhoes. This is, water pumps. This is epic. You just can't possibly comprehend how much stuff was loaded onto these steamboats headed west. Prior to the Transcontinental Railroad, we really used these interior waterways as a primary way to move goods and people as efficiently as possible. And so these steamboat wrecks, they are filled with the stuff that made America. There weren't a lot of folks that had done much work on the Bertrand after the initial excavation. And so every time we grab an object now, we can learn stuff we've never learned before.
Because of Hollywood movies, we tend to think of people on the frontier as just a bunch of rough and rowdy men.
For me, as an archaeologist, if I can get to these collections of artifacts coming off this steamboat, can I use those objects to figure out, why do you pick up and go west?
Hi, Bill.
Hi, how you doing?
I vividly remember the first time I walked into the Bertrand Museum. I was just blown away. That's exactly how I felt. The things that always surprise me the most are the real high-end luxury goods. When were you gonna use that? In the American West. Imagine this covered in mud. When it was initially found, we had no idea what the heck is this thing. It was a mess. It turns out it's a mink stole. a number of different types of china or everyday stoneware that was on board the Bertrand. Lovely pieces that, you know, any frontier home would be really, really pleased to be able to, if guests came over, to put on their table.
The Bertrand had fancy foodstuffs, you know, pickles and preserves and wines and liquor. I mean, these were high-class goods going into the frontier. We had Piper Heidsieck champagne. We uncorked a bottle of it. It was still good champagne.
Back in the 1860s, they found gold in Montana Territory. And people were heading west, trying to look for gold. And if they actually hit it, hit it rich, they had a lot of disposable income. People in the Wild West were actually a little more sophisticated than people think of them as.
Once we got all of the cargo out, we had to decide what to do about the boat itself. Were they going to try to preserve it or not? We couldn't do it. There was just no way, logistically, economically, rationally, to do that. So they decided then to let the Bertrand go back to her grave. But before they pulled the plug, we wanted to figure out why she sank. So measured drawings were made of literally every inch of that boat. So we could build a reconstructed version of the steamboat Bertrand. That's a good job. Beautiful. She was such a shallow draft boat. She sat on the water like a duck. It makes you wonder if there is a clue here as to why she sank.
It was a very risky business taking a steamboat up the Missouri River. It was a notoriously difficult river to navigate. It was shallow, it had lots of sandbars, lots of sunken logs, a lot of snags.
The first boats to reach Fort Benton on the upper Missouri in the springtime were the ones who got the most profit. So naturally, you wanted to get as much cargo up there as fast as you could. It was common practice in those days to overload your boats.
We learned from the Council Bluffs newspaper account that another vessel that was a partner with the Bertrand, the Deer Lodge, actually had to leave about 100 tons of freight at Sioux City because the water levels were dropping really fast. So what that tells us is that literally a few days prior, when the Bertrand left, taking her full cargo with her, she was probably too heavy for the journey she was making. She's sitting too low in the water that's not deep enough for the snags to flow underneath the vessel.
The newspaper account says it was heading upriver towards Montana. At 3 o'clock on April 1st, 1865, it struck one of these snags and immediately started taking on water. The pilot managed to drive it to the western side of the river, and everyone got off safely.
We know there were passenger boxes that were left behind inside the hull of the Bertrand. So can I use those passenger items to figure out what everyday life was like on the frontier? I was really, really intrigued to find out who the actual passengers were.
100 years after sinking, passengers' possessions recovered from the steamboat Bertrand are a time capsule of life on the American frontier.
The most intriguing box in the Bertrand collection held a school slate.
At the top of the slate is carved the name Fanny.
We learn from the newspaper accounts that Anna and Fanny Campbell were two young women who were traveling from boarding school into the Montana Territory to meet their family. Fanny sort of had a larger-than-life sort of persona, so she turns up frequently in historical records. This is basically sort of showing what everybody in the county does, and under Fanny's entry, it says that she's teaching school. It says tomorrow the tree school will be opened under the direction and superintendence of Miss Fanny Campbell, a lady and a scholar in every manner, calculated to take charge of the youthful mind. This is an article about when Fanny bought a ranch. She had horses and cattle, talking about how snug her income must be because she was such a successful rancher. You gotta love that. In her 50s, she ranched 1,000 acres. That's crazy. This is a census from 1910. It lists Fanny Campbell as the head of family. That is really, really unusual at this time period. That's just fabulous. Fanny embodies that sort of frontier spirit because she was fearless. I think I loved her from the moment I saw her slate with that bold child writing Fanny on it. So oftentimes it's the small, tiny items that are really, really telling. These objects are a way for us to sort of get a better understanding of what everyday life was like in the American West.
Settlers continue to push westward. In 1874, gold is found in the Great Sioux Reservation.
The entire westward push was in a public policy called the Manifest Destiny. But the indigenous peoples were really not thought of as part of that. Instead, the idea is putting them on reservations, giving them land. The Black Hills, as traditional Sioux land, was given to the Sioux as long as the sky was blue and the grass was green. It did not mention a darn word about the hills becoming gold.
By the 1870s, and particularly with gold being discovered in the Black Hills and the Black Hills being opened up by Congress, the Army was given the task of protecting the miners from the Indians. So Custer was following his orders to find the Indians that had been out and left the reservation.
On June 25, 1876, the 7th U.S. Cavalry, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, confronts a large Native American encampment.
To take that traditional view of what happened, was Custer surprised by the number of Indians, and his command was surrounded quickly and destroyed by all these mounted warriors. The archaeological record tells us it was much more complex than that.
My name is Ernie LaPointe, and I am a Lakota. My relationship to this battlefield is my great-grandfather, Sitting Bull. My story about this battle is told to me orally. My two granduncles were there. And I'm one of the last survivors who has a story about this, and I'm passing it on.
There were Native American accounts, but they had been largely discounted. The traditional story of this battle is largely based on the military accounts. Custer and his command all clustered together on Last Stand Hill with the warriors just swarming and swirling around him.
They're going, and I run around in a circle, you know. They said we outnumbered him. They try to make Custer look like he was some kind of a hero who was massacred.
That's the traditional view of what happened at that battle. And it wasn't until 1983 and those remarkable discoveries being made that it all changes. It started due to a careless smoker who passed by and threw a cigarette butt out, started a wildland fire. And what that did was remove all the vegetation, and it gave us access to a field. This gave us the opportunity to actually do archaeology on the park.
Have the archaeologists solved the riddles of Custer's last stand?
At that point, certainly those would be the areas that must have held on.
Who is that guy with the beard?
Me. I was 36 when we did the project. I was a supervisory archaeologist with the National Park Service at the time. Melissa and I worked together. We knew each other in Lincoln.
We worked together 84 and 85 as colleagues, and then we started going out together. And of course, in 87, we were married. So yeah, I guess it became more than a collegial situation.
There are marble markers on the field today that allegedly mark where men died in battle.
Part of the reason the Custer story became such a legend was because tons of people have made battlefield reconstructions based on the location of those markers. But of course, the markers weren't put in until like 15 years after the battle. So it's not surprising that those markers and the whole legend have the potential not to be accurate.
Split, it looks like it's been.
So we wanted to find the physical evidence so we could then use that physical evidence to reconstruct what really happened at that battle. What we did not know is how much stuff had been salvaged right after the battle by the victorious warriors. We got our crews lined up and we set a crew out. Yeah, we were worried that maybe there wasn't anything left.
In the ravine looking for those bodies.
And in the first hour they were walking around, they found absolutely nothing. Literally nothing. Right behind them, we had a group of metal detectorists anxious to show us what they could do. The use of metal detectors was a little controversial. They have largely been passed off by archaeologists as the tool of the devil because they were used in looting. But we decided that we would try it in a controlled environment there.
So you'd start to hear the ding, 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 ding.
Detector machines began to sing wildly. Finds were made along the...
In the same time period of that first hour, they had found over 100 battle-related artifacts. Bits and pieces of saddle gear.
Boot nails that were in boots that were attached to human leg bones.
We had the backstrap from a Colt Army revolver.
It was just a lot of fun. I mean, it's like the greatest Easter egg hunt in the world.
But more importantly was the discovery of bullets and cartridge cases. There were hundreds of them. People think of Little Bighorn, especially from the Hollywood perspective, of a bow and arrow fight. We found out of 5,000 artifacts, 12 arrowheads. That tells us they were used, but they were not the most important thing. This was a gun battle.
That's a Henry.
Well, well.
I'll be damned. That's a 44 Henry.
The bullets and cartridge cases were bagged and labeled, and we subjected them to what's called firearms identification. That allows us to determine what type of weapon they were fired in, whether it's Native American or soldier. Around the soldier locations, we recovered mostly cartridge cases from single-shot Springfield carbines. And if you do a few tests, you find out something interesting.
This is the workhorse of the Army in the latter part of the 1800s, and this is the Model 1873 Springfield, accurate up to about 200 yards.
They fire a high-velocity bullet. But we found by experiment that they can take nearly 10 seconds to reload, re-aim, and fire again. Near the warrior sites, we recovered cartridge cases from a variety of guns, specifically a large number of Winchester and Henry rifles.
This is a Model 1873 Winchester. It's a lever action.
Now those can be preloaded with up to 14 cartridges, and we found they can shoot around about every 2 seconds. Now that's an entirely different type of firepower.
Wow, that'd be a little faster than those soldier weapons would fire, wouldn't it?
Quite a bit.
We began to appreciate more and more the skill set of the Native Americans. They knew how to deal with a firearm. They were sophisticated in their weapon systems. They were sophisticated in the use of their weapon systems.
This is a expended 45-70 cartridge here. Probably this is a soldier's position.
It quickly became obvious that those cartridge cases and bullets were going to tell us more. There were microscopic striae in those firing pin marks that would indicate that this cartridge case and this cartridge case found 30 feet from it were fired in the same gun. We can literally follow the movement of some of those weapons around the battlefield, and then we can make presumptions about who carried them. We have clusters of soldiers. A couple of those 3 guys and guns move down, and then we don't see any more movement. Soldiers were trained to fight in place, to get in skirmish line and do what they were told, and they did. And the warriors, on the other hand, were fighting in much more looser war groups. They might stay in one position and shoot, and then move to another position and shoot. They use that terrain to protect themselves.
Each individual Lakota man had his own style of understanding how to defend the people, how to defend the land.
Custer's men were outgunned and outfought based on the analysis of the terrain and where those cartridge cases and bullets were found. The traditional view of the end of the battle is that some element of Custer's immediate command is surrounded and there's this grand last stand. You know, you've got to think about this as what's great on screen is not the way these battles played out. Custer's body was positively identified on Last Stand Hill. He had been shot in the chest and also a gunshot wound to the left temple.
There's so many stories, that come out from all the historians saying Custer was the last guy on the hill. Most of the stories that was told to me from my granduncles, they never speculated or wondered. It was what they see.
Probably at the end of the battle, some men try to break away from the last stand hill and then try to go into Deep Ravine. At marker number 2, at the head of Deep Ravine itself, there were some soldier cartridges indicating that a soldier had fallen there. But more importantly, there were at least 6 different Native American firearms represented in the bullets that impacted in that position. Well, if you've got 6 different warriors firing at that one guy, it suggests you've got the time to have a bunch of warriors cluster together and fire at somebody, which to me suggests that this might be one of the last guys on the field, not Custer.
Your story and our archaeological record are all consistent with how this thing plays out.
Right. It was the guerrilla fighting skills that helped them defeat Custer.
People think of Little Bighorn, especially from the Hollywood perspective, of good guys and bad guys, and the good guys win and all that sort of thing. But both historical record, the archaeological record, and the native narratives, the oral history, tell us it was much more complex. We really do have a better understanding of the past and what happened at that battle.
Despite the Native American victory at the Little Bighorn, westward expansion continues in search of more gold.
When you start to really dig into the real story of the Wild West, you realize that there are lots of people that have a stake in this story that are totally ignored. And as an archaeologist, I feel a responsibility to those people to do the best I can to tell their story, to challenge the stereotypes, to bring in all the other people that were part of the story but are missing from the history books. Bumpy. Coming out of the valley, you drive around these windy hills, and it just seems like it goes forever and forever, and you can just see it so far in the distance. And all of a sudden, you come around the corner, and there's Bodie. Oh my gosh, that's awesome. When you think about gold fever, when you come to a place like Bodie, you see the power of that mineral. Nothing about living here would have been easy. Nothing. Getting here, getting food in, getting shelter, everything was an uphill battle. But people did it because of the potential to go out and get rich. From a young age, I was obsessed with the Wild West. When I was a kid, my dad took me to Virginia City, a silver mining town, and I thought that was so much cooler than Disneyland. Hi!
Welcome to Bodie.
Thanks, how are you?
Good. Gold mining here in Bodie really declined over time, and so people started to move on. That's when Bodie became more of a ghost mining town in the 1920s. My job is to preserve Bodie, freeze it in time, essentially. Today, there's about 150 buildings total. Back in the day, at the height of Bodie, about 2,000. Here we are at the crossroads, Green Street and then Main Street. This would have been the commercial core.
Yeah.
Right, and it was about 1 mile in length.
Uh-huh, wow. Jeez. There are parts that have been preserved, but there's key neighborhoods, key parts of this story that are no longer here. Do you have maps or any sort of imagery from this area to give us a sense of how many buildings would have been here?
What we've been working on is trying to recreate town in that boom years, right, in the 1880s, to basically recreate in a 3D model form and bring it back to life.
We're lucky here at Bodhi, there's lots of evidence to help fill in the gaps in this story. And I've got this image in my head, but I'm really excited to see what Bodhi looked like in 3D color in 1880.
What is very well studied about Bodhi is the core, the downtown, and mostly the buildings. But it's been estimated that more than 90% of what's left of Bodhi is things that you cannot see across the landscape. So there is so much to still investigate. The LiDAR that we're using now is called Simultaneous Location and Mapping, or SLAM LiDAR, which is a handheld device that I can carry around and then use it to scan the landscape and the environment with great accuracy to help us understand the archaeological signature even without digging. Starting from the signature, from their ruins, if we collect the data in 3D, we can use it to reconstruct the entire building. So we can show how the past was, how buildings were before being demolished, and bring the past back to life.
I do photogrammetry with this drone, basically capturing images. And we're going to map this morning, basically to complement the data that Nicholas capturing with the GeoSlam. Woo!
I've seen early photographs, I've seen maps, and one of the things that I've learned is there's still so much that we don't know.
It's amazing to see it come together like this.
Wow, you can really see the size of Bodhi. It looks so much bigger.
You would have shops, mercantiles, barber shops, markets. I think at the height there was about 60 saloons.
This really shows you, I mean, this was a city. How cool.
In this area, there's not much detail. It would be interesting to take a closer look there. There's some buildings that historians have documented, although there's some interpretation of this part of town, it's very minimal. So that's an area that really is screaming for more attention.
I think this could be interesting. I mean, this is definitely some type of ruin, remains of a building.
Come, come, come. This is a medicine bottle. That is so cool. These are distinctive Chinese medicine bottles. So they would contain liquid or pelletized pills. How awesome. One of the first places that the word of the discovery of gold makes it is Hawaii and China, because that's where all the ships were going out of this west coast of California. It was way easier to get to places like that via boats than it was to get across the United States. So I can tell right now we're in a Chinese residence just by the suite of artifacts just in this one little spot. This is so exciting. It's somebody's house. This is the garbage of somebody's life. So this is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Even the Chinese, they had a name for California, Gold Mountain, because of the potential to go out and get rich.
Come see, right here another ruin.
Oh yeah.
You can see here all the foundation.
It looks like dry stacked masonry, and maybe there's some Chinese techniques in some of that architecture?
Yeah, that's what we hope.
So a Chinese miner coming out to look for a gold strike would come against several obstacles. One of them was in many areas, they were not allowed to stake a claim. Chinese immigrants can't buy houses, or if you have a store, fine, you have to pay $50 a month, even though nobody else does. It was just one thing after another, targeting this population to kind of prevent them from putting down roots. However, they figured workarounds. They would partner with folks, they would buy used claims, These folks persisted. They were not cowered in the corners. They were still building lives. They were still being successful.
Whoa, there's Chinatown.
Many of the Chinese chose to take up jobs working for individuals or restaurants, doing laundry, doing domestic tasks.
The Chinese populations contributed to the economy. The money built roads, built cities that we all still enjoy today. And that's lost if you don't look for it. Places like Bodhi, it's here. These stories are just waiting to be told. A more inclusive history is a more accurate way to tell American history.
It's important to correct the story because we can only move forward by having a true understanding of what has been.
This running around in a circle thing is just a figment of imagination of the movie maker. Hollywood doesn't know anything about what I just told you.
When you get into the true history and realize how complex it is, it breaks the myth, it blows the myth up.